Maria Rose Abad. Andrew Anthony Abadi.
September 11th, 2002.
Lawrence Christopher Abel.
The murder of innocents cannot be explained, only endured. And though they died in tragedy, they did not die in vain.
Todd Beamer.
1 year later, the nation remembers.
From ABC News, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. At ABC, we have spent the day marking the anniversary of the September attacks, and of course, so have so many people in the country. We are now in the studio from which we'll be broadcasting our special coverage tonight. This is, as you can see, a dramatic adaptation of the New York skyline and a representation of the lost towers. This was, of course, a day of commemoration. There were important events today at Ground Zero in downtown New York, where the trade towers themselves once stood and from which they're sorely missed. At the newly repaired Pentagon outside of Washington, and at that field in the beautiful countryside of Pennsylvania at Shanksville, where United Flight 93 went down. In the course of this broadcast, this edition of World News Tonight, we will visit all of those places. We'll also have the results tonight of an extraordinary test of international and national security. There are many ways to see this day. One is clearly through the perspective of the president, because he was at each location. And here's our White House correspondent, Terry Moran. Terry?
Peter, for Mr. Bush, this was a day when the duties of his office were ceremonial, emotional, and solemn. Down the long, long ramp leading to Ground Zero, winds whipping up the dust in the pit, the President and the First Lady arrived to pay tribute to the thousands who died here. They laid a wreath, said a prayer, and then, surrounded by the families of the lost, they offered all the comfort they could. A hug here, a firm handshake, a quiet word. As evening came on, there seemed to be time for every family. The muted ceremony in Lower Manhattan capped a day of remembrance for the president. It began at 8:46, the moment a year ago when the first plane hit. From there, the commander-in-chief returned to the Pentagon, astonishingly rebuilt in just a year. The president and the Secretary of Defense watched as a worn and tattered flag was unfurled over the building, just as it had been 1 year ago over the smoldering rubble.
In a sense, we meet on a battlefield. The terrorists wanted September 11th to be a day when hatred reigned. Instead, it was a day when we witnessed love beyond measure.
For Mr. Bush, the moment offered an opportunity to reaffirm a solemn vow to the comrades of those who died here.
At every turn of this war, we will always remember how it began and who fell first. The thousands who went to work, boarded a plane, or reported to their posts.
From the martial pomp and high ceremony of the Pentagon, the president traveled to the tranquility of the fields of Shanksville, Pennsylvania. There he paid tribute to the passengers of Flight 93. The families of the lost gathered around the president here. He lingered with them, signing autographs, posing for pictures for an hour. And as he left, a child ran to him, receiving a presidential hug, brightening for a moment a day filled with tears. It turned out his brother wanted one too. Tonight, the president will address the nation from Ellis Island with the Statue of Liberty over his shoulder. He will talk briefly, aides say, about what he will call the long year that has passed, a year of coming to terms with what he says is the difficult knowledge that the nation has enemies and that we are not invulnerable to their attacks. Peter?
Thank you, Terry. Terry Moran, our White House correspondent. So there's the day as seen from the president's perspective, and he made a huge difference at every place that he went. Each of those places was in its own way, so quite extraordinarily different. Here's ABC's Bob Brown.
From each of New York City's 5 boroughs early this morning, bagpipers began their processions toward Ground Zero. And along the way, New Yorkers joined them on the streets in these hours before sunrise. At 8:46, when the first plane struck the World Trade Center a year ago, there was a moment of silence, observed also by the president on the south lawn of the White House.
They were our neighbors, our husbands, our children, our sisters, our brothers, and our wives.
Edelmiro Abad.
New York's former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani began a reading of the names of all the victims, joined later by other readers.
Joseph Angelini, Jr.
Joseph Angelini, Sr.
On a ramp called Hall Road, because of the debris that was carried out of this pit, mourners joined a procession to a circle of honor, where they placed roses in memory of the victims. At 9:03, another pause, marking the moment when United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower of the Trade Center. Brittany Clark is an 11-year-old whose father died on the 96th floor of the Trade Center. She wrote a poem that made her feel, she said, as if her father was still speaking to her.
I am the soft stars that shine at night. Do not think of me as gone. I am with you still in each new dawn.
John Francis Swain.
Christine M. Swearson.
Brian David Sweeney.
After 2.5 hours, they were still reading the names, 2,801 in all.
They were so much more than just names.
At the Pentagon, where 189 people died, cabinet members and congressional and military leaders gathered on an enormous stage and within a crowd of several thousand, remarking also on how quickly the shattered building has been rebuilt. In Shanksville, Pennsylvania, a bell tolled 40 times for those who died aboard United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in a field after passengers struggled with the terrorists who had taken over the aircraft. The ceremony was attended by more than 500 relatives and friends of the victims.
We remember courageous Americans.
Pennsylvania Governor Mark Schweiker said it was here that freedom took its first stand, and the president visited the site later to speak privately with families. Thousands of people have come here during the last year to create their own memorial, built of dolls and flowers, flags and photographs. Like Americans everywhere today, they have improvised their ways of dealing with grief and preserving images and memories to overcome the images that changed everyone a year ago. Bob Brown, ABC News, New York.
Each of these ceremonies was in its own way very unique, and we had a reporter at each location. To Ground Zero now for a moment to get some impressions about the day from Don Daler. Don?
Peter, I think most of us were expecting this to be a somber and reflective ceremony. What we were not expecting was it to be quite as emotional as it was, almost mournful at times, as the family members made their way down the ramp to lay flowers in the circle, many times openly weeping, still obviously grieving a year later what had happened. And that sea, that river of family members that made their way down the ramp, I think was stunning. And for most of us watching, that was a very strong visual reminder of the enormity of the loss that occurred here and the thousands of families who were forever impacted by those events last year.
Precisely. Thanks very much, Don. The Circle of Honor, in fact, became almost as spontaneous. None of the officials thought people would go inside the Circle of Honor, and they did time and time again. By contrast, at the Pentagon, where ABC's John McCarthy has spent all of the day, John, I think a lot of us thought that it was very upbeat, uplifting, in a way that New York was not.
Definitely more upbeat than there, Peter. There was no reading of the names. The music and the speeches all were trying to take this military family and move them ahead. There was definitely an effort on that. At the end of the ceremony, they'd handed out 10,000 small American flags to this huge audience, and it had a tremendous impact. It was almost like a celebration, if that is possible. There was a case of nerves here today, though, Peter. There was a lot of security around here, and they repeatedly made an announcement to this audience to make them aware that there was going to be jets flying over in honor of the dead at the end of this ceremony, almost as though they didn't want any of the people to be surprised when those jets came in and to have them misinterpret it as something other than what it was.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I would agree with you. It was, as you said, in some ways a celebration of the country's spirit and determination, very evident at the Pentagon. And then there was Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Tiny little place, 245 people, been left sort of off the map in many ways in the course of the last year. ABC's Dan Harris is there. And Dan, I think you were surprised today how many people showed up and their interaction with the president.
There were 500 plus family members here today, and here are some of the words they used to describe what they saw today. Moving, beautiful, a great comfort, they called it. They were gratified, they say, by the turnout today. 5,000 people who came on a windy, chilly day, gratified as well by the portrayal of their relatives, by the speakers as citizen soldiers who fought back and therefore saved lives, and gratified perhaps most of all by all of the personal attention that they got from President Bush. Even people who do not support Bush's policies say they were gratified by the attention and the seemingly genuine compassion he showed here today. Peter?
Thanks, Dan, very much. Dan Harris in Shanksville. There were naturally today on the first anniversary, recollections of the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor. A year after the attack in Pearl Harbor, there were 1 million U.S. men in uniform. And on the first anniversary, the First Lady, Mrs. Roosevelt, wrote, "There would be very little point in celebrating this as a holiday, but there is every reason to keep it in mind so that we are never unprepared again to defend the things in which we believe." In other words, learning from the past without being held hostage to it. Today, Americans have commemorated this day and these ideas in so many different ways. To bring in the rest of the country, ABC's Dean Reynolds.
No matter where you were in this country today or what you were doing, you just had to pause and think.
Good morning.
Americans gathered in large crowds or small, but all for the same reason.
A great loss. A lot of people lost families. The repercussions are still here. Sorry.
Please join me.
As we pause for a moment of silence for the loss that we all incurred.
On this day, the silence lasted for what seemed like an especially long minute and was observed virtually everywhere, from shopping malls to ballparks. It was a silence pierced by the ringing of bells or the blasts of cannon fire in places like Montgomery, Alabama, or rifle reports in Springfield, Illinois.
This was a good way for me to feel as close as possible to the event.
Fighter jets crisscrossed the skies in aerial tribute from Idaho to Lake Michigan and beyond. They released balloons in Columbia, Missouri, bald eagles in St. Louis, and doves of peace in California. 3,000 crosses were positioned in a field in central Washington. 3,000 carnations were dropped in a pool in Houston, and firefighters' boots were placed near candles in Cincinnati. In a Chicago suburb, Muslim school children formed a human chain in sympathy, and a mosque in Los Angeles called this a special day to pray. All of this went on under the watchful eye of the country's security forces, doing what they do every day.
And the truth is that except for a brief commemorative pause in the morning, many people were determined to keep to their daily routines too. To them, that was the perfect gesture.
Remember, the terrorists are cowards, and they think that we are going to be afraid. So what we need to do is face him, and we are going to win.
For a time today, the people of this country broke stride, but then got back to the business of being Americans. Dean Reynolds, ABC News, Chicago.
And yes, of course, as Dean alludes, there was some anxiety in the country today. We all know that the government put the country in a higher state of alert yesterday for the first time since March. And to bring us that part of today, here's ABC's Martha Raddatz.
Early this morning, the Coast Guard stopped a foreign freighter bound for a New Jersey port after inspectors detected low-level radiation aboard the ship. Further tests are being conducted. In Baltimore, 8 Middle Eastern men were taken into custody. Sources tell ABC News that police serving a warrant discovered fake IDs, photos of Times Square, Washington's Union Station, and website information on flight schools. In the air today, 2 scares. Over Houston, an air marshal thought he spotted a passenger with a folding knife. It was a folding comb, but F-16 fighters were called to escort the flight back to the airport. An airliner leaving Memphis was diverted to Fort Smith, Arkansas, after 4 men described as Middle Eastern-looking raised suspicions. The FBI first thought a hijacking might be in progress, but it was another false alarm. Authorities say as long as the nation remains on high alert, no one is taking any chances with security. Martha Raddatz, ABC News, Washington.
The terrorists who attacked the country a year ago started everybody going by breaching airport security, and since then security has become something of an obsession for millions of Americans. ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation for us, is at Denver International Airport tonight. Lisa, this was a day in which, quite frankly, there weren't that many flights and there weren't that many travelers.
Absolutely, Peter. U.S. Airlines cut 3,200 flights today, and at the airports throughout the country, travelers were down anywhere from 30 to 70%. In Denver, for example, this morning during the morning rush, what was typically the morning rush, there were simply no lines, no one at curbside check-in. So things were going smoothly at the airports from that standpoint. People today were flying for a number of reasons. Some said they had to fly for family reasons or business, but a number said they were flying to simply be defiant. One man said, "We cannot be afraid of terrorists."
And from an airline point of view, everybody expect back to business as normal tomorrow in the aviation business?
To be honest with you, they expect it to be slow for the next few days. It may not get back to normal till next week.
Okay, thanks very much, Betsy Stark. Lisa Stark. Now we want to turn to Betsy Stark. Betsy Stark covers the economy for us, and of course Wall Street was deeply affected a year ago, and it took a while today for Wall Street to get going again, but ABC's Betsy Stark covers that for us. Betsy?
Well, Peter, many of the victims of 9/11 worked for financial companies that were located in the World Trade Center. So this was a day of grief and remembrance on Wall Street. Stock trading was beside the point. As one analyst put it to me today, our bodies were there, but our minds were elsewhere.
The world's biggest stock market got underway 2.5 hours late today, and the first order of business was a moment of silence, led by a balcony full of dignitaries. Minutes later, a plaque commemorating those who perished was unveiled outside the New York Stock Exchange.
The top of the plaque, ladies and gentlemen, says it all. Let freedom ring. God bless you. God bless America.
Today was first and foremost a day of mourning on Wall Street. No industry suffered greater casualties than financial services, which makes its home around Ground Zero. The investment bank Sandler O'Neill lost 40% of its workers. Today, it honored those 66 employees in this full-page ad. They were one of several banks and brokerages to memorialize their dead. Bond trading giant Cantor Fitzgerald held a private service in Central Park for the 658 employees it lost last September 11th. Jennifer Gardner's husband was one of them.
It's like moving through a fog today. It's quite difficult. I didn't think it was going to be this hard. I woke up this morning and as soon as 8:46 hit, it was like a ton of bricks.
Well, as expected, trading was light today. The Dow lost 21 points. The Nasdaq fell about 5 points. But the market pundits had little to say about it. Peter, as one observed, this was not a day for economic analysis.
Thanks very much, Betsy Stark, and Lisa Stark in order. As we heard a few moments ago, a freighter registered to a company in Hong Kong was turned away from the port of Elizabeth, New Jersey this morning. Coast Guard inspectors detected a low level of radiation on board. This resonated with us tremendously because ABC's Brian Ross has just spent a long, very intense period of time investigating, good evening, Brian, whether U.S. officials can keep this kind of material out of the country, and you discovered they cannot.
That's right, Peter. We began our investigation by going through court files and seized documents to see how al-Qaeda terrorists had planned to smuggle dangerous radioactive material into the country. Then we followed the same path, using a legal, harmless version of the material to see if authorities could detect it or stop it. Our secret journey started by rail in Austria on the 4th of July. On a rack in the cabin, this suitcase holding 15 pounds of depleted uranium, which we had picked up at a scientific institute in Salzburg. The material, inside a steel pipe lined with lead, is not the dangerous, highly enriched uranium used in nuclear weapons. But scientific experts say it would give much the same signature to detection scanners now in use.
A perfect mock-up. It replicates everything but the capability to explode.
But across 5 European countries, there was no inspection of the suitcase. All the way to Turkey, to Istanbul, considered the crossroads of the world's nuclear black market.
This is what they're looking for, or should be looking for, and this is what they absolutely have to stop.
And then, with surprising ease, we were able to pack our material inside an ornamental chest, crate it, and then place it in a shipping container alongside a cargo of vases and Turkish horse carts.
If it were a real weapon, that you had managed to get out of the Soviet inventory, some would fit in this container.
At 2 in the morning on July 29th, the container arrived at the port of New York on board the cargo ship Singapore Bay. At this point, not a single government official had checked to see what was inside the container.
A weapon could be armed and ready to fire.
So the ship could be the delivery device.
Well, the ship, I think, is one of the most dangerous delivery devices.
Our ship tied up at the Staten Island dock in New York, where U.S. Customs says it has a state-of-the-art system in place to detect even a small, low-level amount of radioactive material like ours.
If we can't tell exactly what's in that container by those screenings, we're going to get into the container and find out for ourselves.
Yet our container left the port without ever being opened by U.S. Customs. It had been targeted for special screening because it came from Istanbul, but still it sailed right through. And a few days after its arrival in the United States, from a place known for its connection to the nuclear black market, the container was on the back of a truck headed for New York City.
We ran it for radiation detection, and we also did a large-scale X-ray.
U.S. Customs Commissioner Robert Bonner said his inspectors correctly singled out the container and would have found anything truly dangerous.
Nothing appeared that would indicate that there was a potential for a nuclear device to be in the container. Or
a large piece of metal in the shipment of Turkish horse carts didn't stand out?
Look, I'm not going to get into it. We have the X-ray pictures.
Could we
looked
see
at
those
them.
pictures?
Yes, I have.
Could we see them?
I don't think I'm going to share them with you.
So we took our own X-ray pictures with a machine much less sophisticated than that of U.S. Customs. And this is what our suitcase looked like a pipe bomb was inside.
If you didn't detect this, you wouldn't have detected the real thing. He missed it, and he's covering up.
As a final step, the container was trucked to a warehouse at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge, across the river from Lower Manhattan.
If that were a weapon and you blew it up, you would have very, very substantial consequences, yeah.
Of course, the material we moved was not dangerous and entirely legal to transport. And even the Customs Commissioner acknowledges our project helps to point out it's just far too easy, Peter, to put something on a ship and send it to this country.
Chilling project. Many thanks, Brian Ross. There were, and we just don't have a lot of time for them this evening, commemorations all over the world today. People in so many countries wanted to participate in this day with the United States, but we have a couple of glimpses. Here is a beach in Australia where hundreds of people commemorated this day. Yes, I thought we'd get a glimpse of it by making a flag out of people who were there. There were 2 powerful beams of light projected into the sky in Paris, reminiscent of what they did here at Ground Zero some months ago, the symbol of the trade towers. And in Venice, in Italy, the city's gondoliers observed a moment of silence, and on so many of the gondolas today, you could see large, billowing, in most cases, American flags. In a minute, we are going to begin our ABC News special coverage for the evening of 9/11. We've been on since early morning, as you know. We want to end this particular portion of the day with something called the Rolling Requiem. Last year, some members of the Seattle Symphony began to explore an idea. What if on this September the 11th, singers in many parts of the world could join together in singing an extraordinary piece of music, which is Mozart's Requiem, which he wrote in memory of a nobleman's wife to be performed during her funeral. He died while composing it. It would start, this Requiem, at the bottom of the world with the first dawn of the day. People would sing it in every time zone for 24 hours. The response to the idea was absolutely huge. It began in Auckland, New Zealand.